Hello, welcome to the commentary track for the album Into the Sun by me, Desar. And I thought about doing this commentary track about the entire album, mostly inspired by there's a radio station in Toronto called 97.3 Boom. And they play a lot of 70s, 80s, and 90s music on there. And they have a series on YouTube called Behind the Vinyl, where they get the actual artist that created a single and that person talks about it, and then they play the record, and while they're playing the record they talk about the entire history behind that song. And it's really interesting because some of the songs that we all love and enjoy, the history behind it and the reason behind it is sometimes a lot more interesting, sometimes a lot more dull, sometimes actually it goes in a direction that you never thought about. And there's this whole theory behind artists, essentially, that they don't like necessarily explaining the art that they created. They rather have it open for interpretation. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's a very bad thing, depending on what kind of artwork it is and what kind of medium and so forth. Most of the time, from all the artists that I've known and musicians, a lot of the time, I would say 90% of the time, the reason that they created was there was no reason. It just popped in their head, and the story behind it that is actually very boring. And that might actually be the case with this album as well. However, I thought it just might be interesting to go ahead and record it, and maybe all of you listening might have a different appreciation and a different thought behind it. So in any case, let me go ahead and get started with this album. So what I'm going to do in this regard, I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to talk about the concept of the album, and then I'll introduce the song. So all the music from the album will be on this track, and I'm not going to talk during the song because that could be really annoying. But at the end of it, I'll talk a little bit more about it, and then I'll introduce the next one and so forth. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the actual album itself, how it came to be. And this album took a really, really long time. Actually, all my albums take an extremely long time to produce. This album started in 2014, actually, and ended, as far as recording wise, back in July 2022, just to give you an idea how long this production has been. And one of the reasons, the chief reason that it's took me so long to produce this album is that I've done a lot of soundtracks for films and television shows, web series, podcasts, and so forth. I worked on 6 soundtracks for films, 2 seasons of my own vlog series, which all had original music that I composed, recorded, and I did podcast soundtracks, and I wrote 2 books, which is not music related at all, but that takes up a lot of time as well. Soundtrack work, in some regards, is like an entire album. Sometimes it could be 2 or 3 albums as far as the amount of production that's involved. And certainly some of the films that I did had a lot of tracks. They were very complex and so forth. And I'll talk about some of that while I'm talking about the commentary for this album. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and talk about the cover itself, which is the visual aspect of it. Let me backtrack. So this is, I think, the 5th album I've produced. And it was it the most difficult? I don't know if it was the most difficult album. So the last time I released an album was back in 2007, and the album was called Beyond the Law. Technology for the music industry and releasing music in general was a lot more traditional, and my previous albums like that were like that as well. My first album came out in 1997. I think that was the year, around 1997. It was Land of the Blind. And all the previous albums from Beyond the Law, which was in 2007 and back, were done in actual studios, in a lot of studios, in studios in Orlando, studios near Salem, Massachusetts, a lot of studios in Cambridge, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Boston, Massachusetts, and so forth. I hired a lot of live musicians to play it and perform on it that I recorded. Some of it was multi-track. A lot of the albums that I did was some of the tracks were recorded in one session, or they could have been multiple sessions and so forth. So this album, I recorded everything myself, in my home studios, using a variety of different instruments, a lot of different instruments, and of course it was challenging to be my own studio engineer as well. And one of the aspects of recording yourself, I mean, what's nice is that you have infinite amount of time and possibilities, versus in the studio, it's literally you're paying X amount of dollars an hour with the engineer and the musician that you're hiring and so forth. So sometimes the song that you're producing goes into a direction that you don't anticipate. Sometimes they're happy surprises, and sometimes they can be absolute disasters. And I won't talk about that, but there's plenty of disasters in the studio that it just went so bad. And a lot of late nights. I mean, and it had to be. It was like an event, almost a performance in itself, to go to the studio, because you would reserve the studio, go in there, and then perform. And sometimes you would not be at your peak performance on that particular day. Oftentimes, sometimes I would have like allergies, or I would have a cold, and I would just not feel really well. But I had booked a studio, everything's lined up. I had to be healthy to do it. It's not like I could necessarily reschedule unless I was really sick. One time I was about to go into the studio to lay down some tracks for on the piano, and I got a tetanus shot, and my left arm, I could hardly even hold it. I mean, raise it rather. And that, of course, that was a problem while performing. I don't even remember which track it was. It came out fine, but it's those type of things. One time I was locked out from the studio, and I didn't have my keys and wallet. Everything was in the studio. It was the middle of the night, and it was really difficult to get back into the studio while all the musicians were like, where the hell did he go? So with this album, it was a lot different, obviously, because I was in the home studio. I had all the equipment and everything. I could lay down tracks. And as far as synthesized music, it's infinitely different and less complex, because all of it is virtual instruments that are utilized. The virtual instruments have all been sampled by actual live instruments, live musicians sometimes, but they're able to be manipulated into a way that sounds very live at times. And I know it might have take things, it gets some musicians out of business at times, because instead of hiring an orchestra, I could have virtual sound library of samples from in the past of a symphony and so forth. But because of that, the artistic medium is a lot easier. So what I'm trying to get at is, if you're a painter and your paints cost, thousands upon tens of thousands of dollars, then all of a sudden those paints become like really cheap, like $1 or $2 to paint with. It helps the artistic medium in your direction of what you want to go. So with this album, it was finally, for the first time, the way that I envisioned it in my head actually became the way that it was recorded and placed down, for the most part. And I'll indicate which song that I didn't quite come out the way that I wanted to, but it was fine for what I essentially needed. So what I'm going to do is, first, I'm going to explain about how this album came to be. The first thing that came into my head about doing this album was the name. And I always like to have the concept of the name of the album to kind of revolve around what the music's going to be. Only because it's easier to write things down with file names and so forth if you actually have a project and so forth. So I had this vision of Journey has this album cover for their album. I think it's called Escape, and it looks like this giant cell or ship where another ship is breaking through. And for some reason, I thought in my head that it looks like it was going in reverse, and that giant shell was like the sun. I can't explain that, but all I know is I had this vision of a ship, you know, ramming into the sun, and that was called Into the Sun. As I started developing the music for it, I had this idea in my head that it was like space oriented, maybe a space opera type of album. This album has nothing to do with that whatsoever, but that's how I started off with, and the first track was kind of space oriented. Um, and at that album, that song is towards the end, and I'll explain about that when I get to it. So that was originally my thought, but as I finally finished the album and I had to come up with the album cover, the thing that really caught me in the head was Into the Sun was like vampire exploding because of sunlight. And in particular, that end scene in the 1920s film Nosferatu, where the vampire raises his arm and then, it just vanishes into the sunlight and dies. The end. And I was thinking, okay, well, I'm going to do something like that. And at first, I wanted to actually actually either use the actual photo, which I didn't know if the copyright would actually be allowed. I'm sure it would. I think it's in the public domain, so I could have used it. But I thought that's not really original. So then I decided to just take a photo of me in front of a window, and starting to become slightly invisible and exploding in the sunlight. And I really don't like having my photograph on an album. It I don't have any actual reason why I don't like it. I just don't find myself interesting to see. I would rather have. I think looking back at it, maybe having an illustration would have been good or something like to that effect. But time was of the essence, and so I just took the photo. And the album itself, like the cover of it, was inspired by The Damned. Had an album that came out in 1985 called Phantasmagoria, and it was a photo taken by Bob Carlos Clark. He was a famous photographer back in the 1980s, and he has this model in the front, and they're taking a picture of it at the Kensington Green Cemetery in Chelsea, London. And it was a very simple concept. It's the cover is all white, so I copied that, and the name of the band is in the upper left, so I put myself on there, Desar, on the upper left, and the name of the album towards the bottom of it. And then I had the photo of me looking at the sun and then slightly becoming invisible. That really cheap effect that was used all the way into the 1920s. And so I created the cover. So after talking about that, which might be a little bit boring, I suppose, but I'm going to go ahead and start with the first track from the album. So the first track is 3 Feet Tall. I started this in January 2017, and I finished it in June 2017. So it took me about 6 months to go ahead and produce it, 6 months, and master it. Took me another month and so forth. And the idea of this was a little bit of this concept where a person is basically alone with their own thoughts, and how those thoughts can be racing. And if you've ever had, like, you couldn't go to sleep because you're bothered by thoughts, after an hour or two, those thoughts just become really scrambled because part of it is you're wanting to fall asleep, and the other part is that you're anxious, and you almost start becoming a little delusional. So that's where this concept was, 3 feet tall. And well, I'm just going to go ahead and play it, and then I'll talk about it more on the other end. So here it is.
You're in a room on a floating house, the windows to see outside. The scratching at the door, a crack is heard. Suddenly, the floor goes out. You're falling again, you're 3 feet tall. Everyone stares at your protocol. The center of the room, all eyes on you. You wrap yourself in your inner tomb. Pick up the phone, there's trouble within. They never ask what state you're in. You better check in to the Bedlam Hotel. You never know when you're going to hell. You're falling again, you're 3 feet tall. Everyone stares at your protocol. The center of the room, all eyes on you. You wrap yourself in your inner tomb. You're falling again, you're 3 feet tall. Everyone stares at your protocol. The center of the room, all eyes on you. You wrap yourself in your inner tomb. The knock at the door, the doctor will see you now. Swap your costume for a dressing gown. He checks your heart, it beats black. Your temperature is never coming back. You're out of your body, you're floating above. No one promised you there's pure love. You're falling again, you're 3 feet tall. Everyone stares at your protocol. You're at the end of the room, all eyes on you. Wrap yourself in your inner tomb. You're falling again, you're 3 feet tall. Everyone stares at your protocol. The center of the room, all eyes on you. Wrap yourself in your inner tomb. You're falling again, you're 3 feet tall. Everyone stares at your protocol. The center of the room, all eyes on you. Wrap yourself in your inner tomb. You're falling again, you're 3 feet tall. Everyone stares at your protocol.
So there you go. It's really interesting to listen to your music, especially for something that you created 5 years ago. And it kind of reminds you of the time back in 2017 and everything, how the world was significantly different than it is now and so forth. And so I started off with that idea of having that giant bass line in the beginning going, and I wanted to have like that drone effect, kind of almost like a didgeridoo type of feel to it, which is one of those instruments that I really love the sound of it. This wasn't sampled from a didgeridoo. This was straight synthesized. And then having the guitar coming in, that guitar sound is that classico echoing reverb, like a ridiculous amount of reverb that's in there, that you hear a lot of time that the Cure used in the 1980s. So I wanted to make sure that I had my guitar to sound like that. Then of course a lot of sampled voices. I recorded that over and over and over, so it had multiple different voices. I think I had at least 15 to 17 vocal tracks of myself. And when I was mixing it, I would just like input it and output it, input and output, and so forth. So I wanted that to sound like almost like a weird, multiple voices type of singing in your head and so forth. And then towards the end, it was just like unraveling. And then also towards the end of it, I kind of had that chorus effect, which sounded almost like a bridge. And that was inspired a little bit from, what the hell was their name? Pixies. Where's My Mind? Sorry, I stopped the recording for a second to look it up. So that song really broke out when the movie Fight Club came out, because it's the end scene where the buildings were, all the credit union buildings, not the credit union, it's the credit card company buildings were exploding and so forth. And then they brought in this 1990s Pixie sound. I don't know if it came from the 1990s or 80s. But anyways, that chorus effect was something that I always liked, and I put that in almost at the last minute while producing this song, 3 Feet Tall. So the next song I'm going to introduce is the second track, and this is called Liz Mort, which means dead lilies. And I started this in February 2020. Early February 2020, and I finished it in May 22. So it took me about 2 years to complete it. The music portion of it was completed took me about 5 to 6 months to do the music portion of it. And then I wrote the lyrics during that time. Then I didn't record it until May 2022. It took a really long time to write the lyrics for this. Actually, every song on this that I sing with the lyrics that I wrote has taken me, it's really tough to write lyrics. Let me just tell you. Some people it's very easy. And a lot of times I think the problem was my technique of writing lyrics was just counterproductive at times. There's always this discussion, and I've talked to many artists, other musicians, like what comes first when they're writing? Is it the lyrics or the music? And each of them has a different way of doing it. I find a lot of times because I can do writing, and that's easy. Not easy. Writing is not easy either, but it is easier than writing lyrics, though. So I can do the writing process, but if I write lyrics without having any structure behind or any music, then when it's time to put the music to it, it sounds like the lyrics are being forced into the music, so it doesn't really feel as organic. And that is really annoying. I think it's off-putting also for the listeners at times. Usually when you hear songs that sound a little bit stilted, or like the vocals go past the music at times, it's usually a song where the lyrics came first and then the music came afterwards. Sometimes it works. I'm not going to knock it. Whatever technique works the best. So what I'm getting at is my technique for writing lyrics was really counterproductive at times, and it wasn't until I saw a documentary a few years ago, which was on Gary Newman, and I think it was Newman in La La Land, or no, Android in La La Land, something to that effect. And there's this one clip where he's talking about writing lyrics, and he shows the technique that he was using, and I took a screenshot of it, and basically I like watched it over and over. I think I watched it about 10 to 15 times, this one little clip where he talks about how he writes the lyrics, and it was just it just completely made sense. It was really easy to write the lyrics then. So the way that I am producing lyrics now and writing lyrics is, first, of course, I have to have the beat sequence, and I'll write out the music, like the underlying music, like the bass line, if there's guitar work. And then I'll go ahead and lay down a track that's basically the vocal track using usually like either a piano or some kind of strings. And that will be the section where I'm singing. And then what I'll do is I'll print that out as sheet music for the vocal section, and I'll break it down into beats on the vocal tracks, and then I know the cadence of the lyrics, and then I'll just go ahead and start coming up with an idea, how the music sounds. Is it a spooky one, or is it creepy or sad or whatever? And I'll start coming up with ideas in my head of what I could use. So it's almost becomes, and Gary Newman explains this even on his documentary that he was doing about how he writes it. It almost becomes almost like a matching game where you kind of have some loose aspect of words and you're matching it towards the beats of the music. And then, of course, adding rhyming sections and so forth and coming up with the choruses. And when I use that technique, it really, really has been helpful. So shout out to Gary Newman on his lyric writings. I'm sure he's never going to listen to this track. I don't even know who's going to listen to this commentary track. It's just me meandering. It's almost like 30 minutes long, and I've only played one song. Anyways, let me go ahead and kick this next song off. I'll talk about it. I'll listen to it along with you, and then I'll talk about it on the other end. So here is Liz Mort.
Your head
there we go, where I go ahead and fade out with the drums. I know some people don't like fade out, but I wanted that to be like a fade out of. It can be easily mixed in. I think DJs like fade out because they can do crossfades and so forth. So it's funny how I talked about the lyrics, and the lyrics are really, really small. There's not a lot of lyrics on here. First off, this song starts off with cello section that lasts, I think, almost like a minute and 10 seconds. And I'm sure a lot of people, when they first listened to this, thought it was just like a weird classical album. And all of a sudden, it splits into having this bass line. And I love having that bass sound that some bands have, with a lot of reverb, that just kind of echoes, like you're in a crypt or in a tomb type of thing. So I wanted that in there. And the song essentially is about, people's lives, digitally. They're the way they are on social media, or the way they portray themselves, on television and radio. And there's two sides of a person. There's a person that's in real life, and there's a person that they portray themselves online. And the problem is when people perceive themselves as being their digital selves, their digital selves is themselves, and they start having a big ego. It's almost like if someone stares at their mirror too long and falls in love with themselves in the mirror, which sounds narcissistic as well, I suppose. But in this song, it's basically, in her house of screams, she is a dream machine. Basically, this misperception of a person's self, digitally in this online world, virtual world that we're in. Don't wake up from life's mirroring. And that's basically how people portray themselves on social media, always in a positive light. No one ever talks about taking out the trash, or how they have to, pay the bills and all this other, regular aspects of life. They always talk about, oh, they went on this great trip to, the tropics and Greece and Rome. Isn't life great? Look at my new car. It's always like this positive spin. Only, it's not really their true selves. And I guess I'm a person that doesn't like misperceptions in that way. And then it says, break the looking glass, where I'm basically saying, break that mirror and break your wings, which is like wings of like the inflated ego that you have. Nightmare of insanity slices your skin, where it's basically your reality is going to really hurt one day. And another cyber hit, which obviously is straight from like, social media, of how people like having likes, and then falling, wondering, calming, slumbering, feeding the machine meeting social media and online presence that sucks your mind, but basically it sucks your time as well. And then rest your head in peace, you're in a fantasy. And then essentially they're only their true selves is when they're sleeping, which means REM, your sleep release. Call your conductor all aboard, meaning your subconscious is basically running the train of your mind anyways. And then falling, wondering, calming, slumbering, feeding the machine that sucks your mind. Essentially, I just copied the lyrics from earlier on. So that is the concept of Liz Mort. And I did use an effect in the vocals that was kind of like a little bit of that David Bowie Scary Monsters feel, and it kind of had a warble effect. When I was mixing it, I was moving the positioning of the vocals from the left to the right ear. So if you're listening to headphones, there's a little bit of, you can feel that tension behind it. And yeah, so that's the track. So the next one I'm going to talk about, and earlier on at the start of this commentary track, I talked about how like there's stories behind it. And this one is probably the most frustrating story. So I started this in December 2017 when I first started laying down the music tracks, and I finished it in February 2020. So it literally took me 3 years to produce this. And During that time, I was also working on soundtracks and so forth. Um, but I would always go back to this album and adjusting it. The music was fine. I didn't have any trouble with the music. The lyrics behind it was a little bit difficult to do at times, writing out the lyrics and so forth. And one of the things that really plagued me with this was doing the vocals. So this was the very first track that I started recording vocals, and I learned all my mistakes and did all my mistakes from this vocal track. And I think I spent like a year doing the vocals. And I don't know if you produce art or you do work, if you do stuff so long, you start hating it because you just constantly are working on something over and over. And a part of you like wants to just scrap the whole thing and never do it again. And the other part of you is like, I did all this work. I'm not going to just throw it away. And sorry, I just bumped into my microphone. I just get so frustrated with even talking about this song. You work so much on a song. I didn't want to throw away this song. I thought there was some promise to it. But the vocals, I had a lot of trouble with the vocals. I recorded over and over. I had 30 to 40 vocal sessions that I recorded it. And I think I had about 60 to 70 takes of vocals. So what I did, I just layered the vocals over and over and over. So it was this idea that there's like all these zombies are coming out of a crypt and singing all at once. And kind of reminds me of that Disney ride at Haunted Mansion at the end where all the ghosts come out and they start singing. It's actually one of my favorite rides of all time. And so that was the idea behind this. So I'm going to go ahead and play it. At the other end of it, I'll talk about it some more. So here it is, Crypt.
She's forgotten now. 6 feet under, there you're not. Couple of us start making love. Smell of blood is too much now. We'll play. Hey, 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 the dead. We'll play. Hey, 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 hey. Just bells ring, stop everything. The bride and groom exchange their rings. Undead or crash through the door. Bite and chew, such a bloody girl. Dead, we'll play. Hey, 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 the dead. We'll play. Hey, 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 love from heaven above. 1 from 6 feet below.
there you go. That was Crypt by yours truly. And at the conclusion of this one, or it's like when I was producing it, I realized that the direction of this album was going to be very gothic, very dark. Obviously with a title called Crypt. And I finished the lyrics on this in 2019. Besides just overwriting, re-recording the vocals and over, I also was tweaking the lyrics constantly to kind of suit this song. And essentially, it starts off with the lyrics. She was 17 and she knew everything. She snuck out at 2:45. So basically, a 17-year-old woman leaving the house, sneaking off with her boyfriend on a motorcycle, and basically going to the nearby cemetery. So they drove through the gates at Burial Hill. Now, there is my all-time favorite cemetery. I love cemeteries. They're quite remarkable, the architecture and so forth. My all-time favorite cemetery is Burial Hill in Marlborough, Massachusetts. And if you ever get the chance to go to Salem, you can take a side road trip to Marblehead and go to Burial Hill. And the location is like it's at the top of the hill overlooking this town of Marblehead, and you can see the ocean in the background and so forth. And they have a lot of tombs and crypts and tombstones from the 18th century and also the late 17th century. And just some of the designs on these New England tombstones are just really remarkable. I'm sure you might have even seen, they have a really famous one that the skull that's holding a moon in one hand and then a sun in the other. And they filmed movies there whenever they filmed in New England. So there's scenes in there. And then also there's a pond that's right next to it that's very nice. In the wintertime, you can go ice skating on and so forth. So I went there quite often, and sometimes I would just go there to read books sometimes because it's nice and quiet, and the sea air cools it down, especially in the summertime. So essentially, going back to the lyrics, the 17-year-old woman goes to the burial hill. She dies along with her boyfriend, and then she just gets like buried there. And then it says the dead will play. So all of a sudden the dead come out. And then 10 years later, she's forgotten. And then there's another couple that goes there. And then the one that died comes out of the burial ground and like attacks them. Of course, church bell ring, which was literally from the church bell that was in the start of this song, and talking about the bride and groom exchanging their rings. And then all of a sudden, the undead come from that burial hill and go to the church and then attack everyone. And that was it. It wasn't very much to it as far as the lyrics, but I thought it was kind of fun. Hope you enjoyed it. So this next one track is called Rise at Dusk, and this was actually the latest one that I went ahead and produced. So Rise at Dusk I started in June 2022 and I finished it in July of 2022. So it was the very last song that was on the album, and I had two songs that were like that were basically tacked on at the last minute because I needed to fill it out to have enough songs for an entire album. And I really like this song. I think most artists and musicians always like the last thing that they produce because you're always hoping that you're doing things better and better. So it's a very, very quick song. The lyrics, kind of simplistic, I think, in a way, but it has a nice catchy beat to it, and certainly, I hope people will enjoy it. And of all the tracks on this album, I think this one is the most danceable. And hopefully people can actually dance to it. So without much further ado, as they say, here is Rise at Dusk.
of all eyes upon me as I dance on the stage. Don't care about anything, it's all too much. Time means nothing here. Have no fear, love disappears. Swing on and on. That's on the floor, dancing minuets, low cigarettes, dark leatherettes. Don't give up.
There we go. Rise at Dusk. I feel like I'm a radio DJ. Now at 104.7 Mix FM. All right. Rise at Dusk. I wrote these lyrics very quickly. Not very complex lyrics, as I must say. So it was inspired when I was creating the music. Obviously, I wanted something that had a bit of 80s and 90s sound to it. I was using that classical Juno drum sequence that you can hear in the beginning, that you've heard many songs using similar instruments, synthesized instrumatic. I don't even know if that's a word. Drum sound to it, and then of course that classical 80s type of Juno sound as well. And I think that was a little bit of inspired of watching Stranger Things, I must admit. But I really wanted to have a little bit more of a vibes of like the 1990s. So this was essentially the typical anyone, when they're younger, going to nightclubs and stuff like that, and getting ready to get dressed up and going out on the town to go dancing and so forth, and getting dressed in that excitement. And that's essentially what this is about. However, I was also thinking in my mind while writing the lyrics and doing the song of the 1983 film The Hunger, which has David Bowie in it as a vampire. And essentially, I'm writing a little bit of that, imagining in my head that he's getting ready to go to a goth club. And of course, it's that legendary scene in the beginning of The Hunger where Bauhaus is playing. It's one of the greatest gothic sequences in movie history, in my opinion. So the lyrics go: can't wait until midnight to rise from my grave. Obviously, vampire. Never step into the sunlight. Originally, I wrote it as I'll step into the limelight, but I think it's a little bit more vampire-esque, obviously. Never to step into the sunlight. And then do what I crave. And then all eyes upon me as I dance on this stage. Obviously, someone dancing. It's all too much. At one time, it was depraved. And then time means nothing here, which obviously, if you're having a good time, time seems to go very fast. And then bats on the floor dancing minuets, clove cigarettes, which were very popular in the 80s and 90s. Of course, they're banned now in the United States. And then dark leatherettes, that was obviously a homage to a song, Warm Leatherettes. And then go, don't give up, don't give in, etc. And that was it. I wanted it very simple. I also wanted it to be a short track because I think sometimes songs can be really long, and obviously some of my songs on this album was way too long, so I wanted to have a quick one that people want to re-listen to. And so that's basically the story of Rise at Dusk. So the next one is another single. Notice I have no edits whatsoever on this commentary track. This next song is called Exhale, and I started this in May 2022 and finished in May 2022. In fact, the whole thing was done on May 28th, 2022. And it's a very simple piano and vocals track. And whenever you do a piano and vocals arrangement as a song, while it seems really simplistic, it's actually one of the most complex things to write out. And I recorded this simultaneously. I think this was the second or third take. I only did 3 takes of it. So it's like the antithesis of some of the other ones that were like really ridiculously overproduced at times. This was probably underproduced, but and I used a piano that was sampled directly from Abbey Road's studios over in London, and made sure that all the organic sounds of the piano was there, the pedal, sustain pedal, and so forth, and the sounds of the keys. So it, I think the piano sounds really great, and I wrote these lyrics after. I mean, it's kind of a sad reason. It was essentially seeing on television and on the news all these school shootings. So this really is kind of a dedication to that, children having horrible things done to them, and their lives ended while it was so early on. So I don't feel comfortable talking too much about the lyrics of this, but if you listen to it, essentially you can understand that I was really writing about that and just letting it out. But universally, not just about the things that happen to children, from school shootings, but anything in general. When things get really tough at times, if you get really stressed out, oftentimes if you just do inhale and then exhale really slowly, and if you do that a few times, you realize that, for one, you're still alive, you can still breathe, and as long as you can do those 2 things, you got this. You can control what's going on. So that's really where that stemmed from the lyrics. So without much further to talk about it, here is the song Exhale.
Exhale when it's too much. Inhale when you feel out of touch. Exhale when your world collapses in. Inhale when you can no longer swim. It's out of bounds, it's out of time. The situation is too much to climb. Get out of the hole we are within. Press restart. Let's begin. Exhale when it's too much. Inhale when you feel out of touch. Exhale when your world collapses in. Inhale when you can no longer swim. The things we see on TV will not set us free. Please take us home. Knock our leaders off the thrones. Exhale when it's too much. Inhale when you feel out of touch. Exhale when your world collapses in. Inhale when you can no longer swim. Watching time pass us by. When asked, they deny their futures are all dead. Their future lessons are all unread. Exhale when it's too much. Inhale when you feel out of touch. Exhale when your world collapses in. Inhale when you can no longer swim.
And that was the song Exhale. So this next song is called Die. And I realized maybe the track placement is probably inappropriate for, after such a sad song and what it was about, but then putting Die. But I wanted to amp up the feel of it a little bit more, to go from the downer to have like this really grinding sound. And this song Die, I just made the song up because it was just like the two lyrics that are in it. And the song was produced, it was the end credits for a film called Stiff that came out in 2010, directed by Mike McKean and Jim Towns. and it was the end credit sequence, and I wanted to have really that 1990s feel to it, that heavy metal grinding sound and so forth. So I had a lot of fun with the guitar work, and there's actually a little bit of a sample of I at the time I had an antique sickle, and I would rub it against a stone, and I recorded that. And actually, I think I recorded that sound probably in 2016, actually. So if you hear like a little metal sound in it, that's the sickle, like an antique sickle grinding against a stone, like sharpening it. So I wanted that in there, um, simply because it's fun to add organic elements like that sample to it. So there's not very much more to say about it. It's very quick sound, lots of guitar work, really pounding drums that I put into it. And so here is the song Die. So that was the song Die. This next song is called Rewind, and it's the longest track on the album. And this is actually a soundtrack that was for a film that hasn't been released yet called Rewind. And I'm not going to talk much about the film itself, simply because it might still come out. And the film is directed by Jason Santos, which I worked with him on many different films in the past. I did music supervisory work for him as well. We go way back, and he asked me to do this and the concept of this short film that he was producing. So I did this. When I started this one, I think it only took me, well, whenever you do soundtracks, you don't have a lot of time to work. So that's the other thing that's different than producing albums. You have a very limited amount of time. So you have to put in a lot of hours very quickly at it. And well, I can't talk about the idea behind it, but the engineering of it and the composing of it, the idea was that I wanted to show like time. That was a big thing. And I spent probably 2 days trying to get the right sample recorded of a ticking of a clock, and some of the other sounds that you hear into it was audio recordings that I processed and so forth. And this was one of the tracks where I was learning a little bit more about virtual instruments, and I used a ridiculous amount of sounds in there and music, and I wanted to convey like this chaos of sound and the chaos of time. And so when I was producing, that's what I was constantly going in my head. And I didn't want the listener ever to be comfortable. I wanted to be like one of those roller coaster rides where you're riding, and all of a sudden you go up a hill, and then you think you're going to drop, then you're not. You're going around a circle, and then boom, all of a sudden you're dropping. Like, what the heck is going on? So that was the feel for it. So here is the song Rewind. It's all instrumental, no lyrics or anything. So that is the song Rewind. So this next track is called Dies Natalis Solus Invict, which is also an instrumental track. And in the year 2018, I had a vlog, and it lasted 2 seasons, where basically it was the name of the vlog was called Brooklyn, where I went all around Brooklyn, some parts of Manhattan, and I recorded the things that I could find there that were interesting or unusual. And of course, I had to create original music for it, so I created music and put it in there. And this track was one of those tracks, and I had to go to Seattle, and I filmed when I was in Seattle, and so I wrote this out with that in mind. A little bit of feeling of Twin Peaks in there by the composer Angelo Badalamenti, who was always a big inspiration for me. I always regret the fact that I had the chance of meeting him a few years ago. My wife and I, Leonora and I, went to see David Lynch, who was doing a talk. He was getting interviewed at BAM in Brooklyn, and my wife was going to the restroom, and I was waiting nearby, and there was this guy that was sitting there on the table, and I was like, he looks interesting. I wonder who he is. And then it wasn't only until during the actual lecture that David Lynch was speaking, he said, "Oh, yeah, my friend Angelo is here. Angelo, stand up." And there was Angelo Badalamenti. So I was right next to the guy, and I couldn't, I missed the chance of saying hello back then to him. So I always regret that. The very first soundtrack that I worked on was in the 90s for a film called The Accursed, that never got released, but I did a tremendous amount of work in the studios and recording it. And the director at the time said, "Make it sound like Angelo Badalamenti, that feel to it." I didn't know who the heck this guy was at the time. I wasn't a Twin Peaks fan then. So I looked it up and I listened to it over and over and over obsessively. And then I became a Twin Peaks fan, was because of the music. So anyways, that was kind of like what I had in mind when I was producing this. I've talked much more about the song than the song is as far as length. So without much further ado, here is Dies Natalis Solus Invict. right, and that is Dies Natalis Solis Invictus. So this next song is the very first song that I created for this album. Back in February 2014, I composed it and recorded it in February 2014. And this was the idea that I was going to create a space operatic type of album. And the title of this song is Travel to Mars. And when I was creating it, I was thinking of traveling to Mars and in space and so forth. And I was using an older technology back then, acid tracks, for any of you that are musicians and so forth, which actually was, when I was mastering this album, started to become a problem because that software is no longer around, in its current incarnation. And it was difficult to reprocess things and record it. But anyways, that's boring technical talk. So the idea of this was like heading off to Mars and all the crazy things that it could be happening there. It really sticks out on this album. Like the rest of the songs kind of have slight dark undertones. This one is kind of like la la, but I didn't want to get rid of it because it was the original song, the very first song that I created. So I definitely had to have a way of releasing it. So with that in mind, here comes the song Travel to Mars. was Travel to Mars. So let's go back to Earth. Ah, such a comedy type of commentary, isn't it? This is the last song, and this is called 2055. And that was about the year 2055. That's just a random year that I came up with. That's like far into the future. And I wanted to have like that Blade Runner type of feel to it. I used a Korg MS-2000B for this track, and using some other synthesizers, Juno and so forth. And I wanted that feel of, the doom of the future, but also having that Blade Runner vibe to it, with that loud, brash, synthesized horns and etc. So when you're listening to this, I want you to imagine robots, androids walking around, people wearing really fascinating looking clothes with sunglasses and lots of neon lights everywhere. I don't know why we still have neon in 2055, but all the science fiction movies always do. And it's always clean. If you've noticed, they're always like, it's either super clean, like everything is stark, clean and white and new, or it's like decayed, old, and like that old city grime. There's never any middle road, So I always thought that was interesting. So anyways, here is the last song, 2055. Enjoy. That was 2055, and back to the current decade. I hope you enjoyed the album. I hope this commentary, you got something out of it. I think it looks like the running time is like going to be close to 1 hour and 40 minutes. I hope this could be interesting for you to introduce the album like this. And I look forward to doing the next album. I'm already started the next album, and I don't know which direction it's going. I hesitate to say what kind of album it is because when I started this one, Into the Sun, it was going to be a space opera. Didn't turn out that way. Went completely different into a gothic um, feel to it. And the next album is definitely going to be an album, and definitely will have music and lyrics and so forth. So yeah, I look forward to releasing more, and you being able to listen to more. So thank you again. Hope everything's going well for you on the other side of the audio vortex here, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.